Welcome to Unit 4. We are in the home stretch. You have this lecture plus 2 more, and you're absolutely done with Texas government. So this lecture is about public policy in Texas, and it's kind of the behind the scenes things you hear on the news about taxing and spending in Texas and kind of issues surrounding that. So let's talk about where Texas raises money. There are lots of different taxing issues. So there's a debate on who we should tax and how much we should tax, and what the taxes should use to fund. Where should we use our money? Texas gets a significant amount of its state revenue, 33%, or $72 billion with a B dollars from the federal government. And that generally comes from the Department of Health and Human Services. It's used, there's also a lot of money that goes to the Highway Department, used for transportation and infrastructure. But what you should know, what the takeaway from this is that Texas does get a significant chunk of money from federal grants. And then finally, Texas can raise money by borrowing money if there's an emergency. It must be approved by 4/5 of the legislature. They can issue general obligation bonds. So these are bonds that will temporarily increase taxes and bring in money for something that benefits everybody, like prisons or water development, other community-wide or statewide issues or statewide projects. And then there are revenue bonds, which are used for higher education. This is a kind of a picture representation, if your brain thinks in visuals like mine does, to show where Texas gets its money. So as you see, like we talked about, big chunk from federal funds, and then there's a general sales tax. So whenever you go to the store and you buy something that is not food, so you buy a shirt or you buy a candy bar, I'm sorry, not like food that you need, then that is subject to sales tax. And all of that sales tax from everybody, from all of their purchases added together, goes into this chunk. If you buy a car, then you pay a lot of taxes on that. That's a big chunk of taxes. And that goes into this motor vehicle sales and rental taxes. Also goes in there is if you rent a car, like say you rent a car from Hertz, then you'll see that there are all kinds of different taxes, and those taxes go into this slice of the pie. There's margins taxes, which are just taxes that businesses pay on their taxable income. There's the motor fuels tax. So when you get gas, you will see that there's a certain portion of that is taxes in that price per gallon. There's severance taxes. So when somebody takes oil or natural gas or something like that from the land and severs it from the land, that is where the severance taxes come in. Other taxes, and then other receipts, just kind of other places that Texas is able to get money from, rentals or sales of property, things like that. So let's talk about the history of taxes in Texas. In 1913, the 16th Amendment to the United States Constitution gave the federal government the power to issue a federal income tax. And this is where the federal government gets most of their money. So when you pay your taxes on April 15th every year. That is your federal income tax. Now, most states have a state income tax as well. So if you lived in, say, Illinois, then you would pay your federal income tax, but you would also be paying a state income tax. You'll know if you use like TurboTax or something like that to do your taxes, then when you finish your federal return, they'll say, okay, let's start your state tax return. And then they'll give you like a, little woohoo message that says, your state doesn't require you to pay state income tax, which is a huge bonus to living in Texas. I promise you, that is a way that Texas employers are able to get people to come live in Texas and work in Texas, is because there's not a state income tax. And this is something that even like professional athletes will consider when they have two teams that are super close in compensation and prestige and kind of where they would fit in the team, what it would do for their career, and they look and see one of them is Texas and there's no state income tax on top of their money that they're going to be getting. It's a big push. So until 1931, most of the state's tax revenue was from property taxes. But when the Great Depression came, that changed everything, because all of a sudden property values went way down. And when property values go down, that's what your taxes are based on. And so when your property value goes down, the tax revenue would go down. So that is where Texas had to start getting creative about where to obtain money from other places. So in 1931, the legislature enacted a cigarette tax. And so all of a sudden, if you bought a pack of cigarettes, there would be taxes associated with it. And they still are today. 1933, beer was starting to be taxed. 1935, distilled spirits. Sometimes people will talk about these as like the old sin taxes, because, and that's like SIN space TAX, not SYNTAX, but these are the taxes that would traditionally be associated with, like risky living or something like that. And so those things were easier for, Puritans and people to live with taxing, because they're more of something that is a choice versus a requirement. But in 1961, there was a decrease in property taxes and an implementation of the general sales tax. And that is where we get the tax on everything from, clothing to non-essential food. So, for example, like bread and milk are not taxed, but like, Coke or Snickers or something like that would be taxed. And eventually the state property taxes were abandoned. We still pay property taxes, and that is property taxes that are for your county, like they're run through the county. They are specific to where you live, like your school district or hospital district, things like that. So again, just the types of taxes in Texas. There's general sales tax, which is just a broad tax on most things that you buy. Selective sales tax, which is the tax on things we talked about that you don't actually have to have. You could actually live without. So liquor, cigarettes, gasoline, things like that. These are also called excise taxes or hidden taxes because, for example, with the general sales tax, if I go buy a pair of jeans that are, like $50, then when I go to the register, they will say, okay, your total is whatever 50 is times my sales tax rate in the place where I buy them. So that will be, they'll like actually add that on at the end. With these other taxes, so gasoline, for example, it's not that you say, okay, this gas is $1.29 a gallon, and then when it rings up, it's $1.49 a gallon. They just tell you what the price is with the taxes all rolled in. And then there's a gross receipts tax, which is the tax on the revenue, the gross revenue of certain places. So it's like if you're a corporation or a limited partnership, you pay franchise taxes. But then if you have some kind of other business, you don't necessarily pay these gross receipts taxes. So how does this apply in Texas? So there is a sales tax for this whole state. Everybody in the state starts with a 6.25% sales tax rate for retail items, non-essential foods, things like that. And then they will add on extra taxes locally. So you'll sometimes if you're you'll say, well, my tax rate is 8.25 if I go buy something in Tarrant County. Well, yeah, because that extra 2% is going towards local or county government. The severance tax we talked about is tax on the production of a raw material. So when oil is taken from the ground, severed from the ground, or natural gas is taken from the ground, then whoever is with extracting it pays a tax on that. There are special taxes that apply tobacco, like we've talked about, alcohol, motor vehicle, registration of motor vehicle. When you register your car every year, there's a tax associated with that goes into the pot for Texas. Hotel and motel occupancy, these are taxes that are paid by people generally outside of the state or the locality, and they benefit that local area. So a lot of times they'll benefit maybe the local public spaces like arenas or parks or things like that. And then insurance company operations are taxed specially as well. Like we talked about, in addition to the 6.25 tax rate that is a state tax rate, there are additional local sales taxes, and then there are the ad valorem taxes on real property. So if you have, like we said, you have a house, then you pay your property taxes once a year, and those taxes don't go to the state; they go to your county, and they benefit things like your school district that you're in, your hospital district, things like that. Who sets these local taxes? The city council or the county commissioners. There's, board of trustees if there's special districts like the special DFW, airport district, things like that. So that is why sometimes we don't think very much about these local elections, but that's why it's important, because these local elections can cost you a lot of money potentially, or they're having to deal with the receipt of a lot of money, and you want to make sure that they're spending that wisely. So just some very, very basics about taxes, and I basically go through this not only because it's covered in materials for the course, but also because it's something that sometimes that you don't get in high school education or other classes. It's something that people assume that and not all of us know this, and that was me included. A tax base is what is taxed, and the tax rate is the amount that's levied. So for example, if I buy a $100 bag, like a purse, then that $100 is the tax base and 6.25 is a tax rate, and that is what the tax is on that back. So there are lots of economic courses that cover kind of where the sweet spot is to put the tax rate so that it does not lead to a decrease in the amount of money raised. So if the taxes get too high, you'll see there's a tipping point where all of a sudden taxes are too high, so people just quit doing it. So for example, say if the gasoline tax was, $10 a gallon or something like that, that would probably be too high, and most people would just stop driving. They would start telecommuting or start riding their bike or, figuring out some way around it, because it wouldn't make sense to pay that tax. And then all of a sudden the money raised from the gasoline tax would be almost nothing because the taxes were too high. So that's kind of the whole study of economics and government, is to try to figure out where this sweet spot is. So why are taxes levied? They're levied to raise money for some certain thing, either the state or the local government. But when a local government, for example, is trying to decide how to tax a group of people, what kind of taxes they should vote for, they have lots of, different options. They can vote to implement a tax that regulates a behavior, either rewards a behavior like the green tax incentives. If you make a environmentally beneficial improvement to your home, you'll get a tax break. So that's rewarding good behavior. Now, like I talked about, the sin taxes for things that have, a moral opposition to them sometimes, like alcohol, cigarettes, strip clubs, things like that. Some want to punish that behavior, so they will implement taxes there. The reason why these taxes to regulate behavior are justified is because the argument is these are completely voluntary ways to spend money and completely optional. For example, when you're replacing your water heater, you don't necessarily need to buy a tankless water heater that's going to be super eco-friendly. You can buy just a regular water heater. It's optional. And same with, you don't have to go to a strip club. That's completely optional. You can or you cannot. There are taxes to raise money from people who get a certain benefit. So if the taxes from gas sales go to highway improvements, because the people who are buying gas are driving on the highways, and so they are benefiting from good highways. Hunting and fishing licenses will fund wildlife preservation so that there are things to hunt and fish. There are charges like taxes on college expenses that are used to fund the actual schools that the people who are paying the taxes attend. Sometimes it's hard to determine who actually receives the benefit from the taxes that are paid, and sometimes there's a lot of argument, So is it just the people who buy gas who are benefiting from good highways? What about people who ride their bikes, or people who are living in the area where there are good highways that are that they can travel on, even if they're not actually buying the gas, they are their kids are riding in school buses and somebody else bought the gas, and they're benefiting from those improvements, things like that. There's a lot of issues when we think about why it takes legislature so long, either federal or state legislature so long to come to an actual resolution of an issue. It's because there are so many different things that have to be discussed and things that have to be considered, like this. And then sometimes we tax people because they are able to pay. So this is where we get the sales tax or property tax. If you're going to buy a giant house, you have the ability to buy that house. You also have the ability to pay for the taxes on that house. It wouldn't be fair if taxes on property were all the same amount. So for example, if you owned a house, you pay $5,000 in tax. Well, what if you own a house that is, only cost $15,000? Well, then you're paying a third of the amount of your house in taxes. And then on the flip side, it's not fair if somebody buys a house that costs $100,000, then they are paying just a fraction of the cost of their house in property taxes. So we tax people at different rates based on their ability to pay. Sales taxes, again, if you buy something that is expensive, it's because you can afford to pay the tax on it too. And we're not making everybody pay the same amount of taxes on, for example, a bag, because if I buy a $100 bag, then and I'm paying the same tax dollars that somebody who buys a $20 bag, that's not fair. The more valuable the item, the more able you are to pay the tax. The problem is that when you look at the graph of people who have a lot of money spending money, they end up spending less percentage of their money on taxes than people who have a little bit of money. So just because they're able to have all of this extra money to not spend on taxable things. This is where online learning is difficult, because I would really love to talk through this with you and draw graphs and things like that. But just know that the wealthy on these ability to pay taxes, the wealthy end up spending less in dollars and percent than people who have less money. So, this is a little bit of a depiction of how this works. If your salary is $50,000 a year, you spend about 90% of your salary on taxable incomes. You don't have a big margin there. You end up spending, even if your tax rate is 8.25%, like everybody else's is, you end up spending about 7% of your money that you make in a whole year on taxes. Now you go up to, if you make $1 million a year, you are able to only spend about 20% of that money on taxable items. The rest of that is in tax-deferred items, non-taxable items, or just saving. So you end up only paying about 1.65 of your entire yearly salary on taxes. So you see that even though you're paying $16,000, that's just a fraction of your total yearly income on taxable items. So sometimes you'll hear and a regressive tax is where the tax rate decreases as your income increases. And so this is something like a sales tax or a consumption tax, like a cigarette tax, for example. So you can see it's the same graph we talked about a few slides ago, where, let's say you're going to be spending the same amount of money, the same amount of cash on something like cigarettes. If you make more money, it doesn't necessarily mean that you smoke at you're able to smoke at a higher rate than somebody who makes less money. If you smoke, you smoke. And, if you're a pack-a-day smoker, it just is more difficult for you to buy a pack a day of cigarettes if you make $50,000 than it is if you make $300,000. And so that means this is a regressive tax where the tax rate, the effective tax rate, decreases as your income increases. Tax shifting is when the business is building taxes into the cost of their goods or services. So if you go to a strip club and there's a $5 tax on the strip club patrons, then that's passed on to the person who's visiting the club. It's not that the person owning the club is just going to pay that tax out of the goodness of their own heart. They are going to pass that tax along to someone else. What kind of taxes do people in Texas pay? Generally, largely regressive because it is not an income tax, which is progressive. And because most of our taxes are paid by sales tax. Most taxes are paid by those with lower income and less are paid by those with higher income. The reason for this is the people with higher income, we give more power to invest their money or save their money. We hope that they, will put it in a place that they will be able to save it. And so it's harder to get taxes from them, easier to collect taxes from people with lower incomes because sales taxes are much easier to collect than a more complicated tax scheme. Okay, so let's talk about where Texas spends its money. They spend a lot of money on education, a lot of money on health and human services, some money on transportation, some on public safety, criminal justice, and then just kind of extra other places that they spend money. How do we decide where to spend money? There's lots of ways that we consider deciding how to spend money. Again, this is why your local elections are very important because these are the people, the state and local elections elect people who decide where we're spending money. We spend money on education, healthcare, income support programs, income redistribution, which is welfare, and transportation. We're going to talk about each of those individually. Let's talk about education first. So there's lots of issues relating to education spending. Earlier constitutions, you remember that there was no spending on education. You couldn't spend money on education. And then after the Civil War, there was a provision that the state could spend money on education, but it had to be on segregated schools. There have been grants of land for schools, that is spending of money, giving of land from the state to schools. There is compulsory attendance. What happens if somebody doesn't attend school? What kind of money is spent to get those people to attend school? And what kind of punishment is there if they don't? Free textbooks, that is something that was debated, whether or not the state would provide textbooks. The Texas Education Agency manages all of the issues on education spending, and they also manage all of the educational regulations. There is, debate about whether schools and teachers' pay should be judged on how students do on standardized testing. So, should schools that have more children pass their standardized tests get more money, and their teachers get more money than schools that have a lower pass rate? And there are 1 million different things to argue about with that issue. So currently about 9% of education spending comes from the federal government, 41% comes from the state government, and 50% comes from the local government. Again, local elections are important. Who is in charge of public schools? It's a state and local partnership. The local has most of the control, but the state sets up guidelines. There are supervisors who are not part of the government who administer things in public schools. So, for example, the superintendent, that is not an elected position, but those people are the supervisors that supervise the school district, and there is an independence from the general structure of government. So not every single piece of the school is run by somebody who is elected. It is people who are somewhat detached from the general structure of government. Decisions are made by the State Board of Education and by independent school districts that operate across city and county lines, and they do things like hire and fire different teachers, principals, superintendents. They also, there are charter schools that operate outside the system. So this is a big deal that has happened recently in North Texas, is the increase in charter schools that do not have to I'll say follow the same rules necessarily as other independent school districts have to. Some of the issues about school funding are, do you get a better school the more money you spend on that school? Some would say yes, some would say no, and I think that there are studies that show both ways. State funding gives money from the Permanent School Fund of 1854, which is funded by rental sales, mineral royalties from Texas public lands, and also interest. The interest and the dividends from that only can be spent. You can't touch the actual principal of the money that is put into the fund, so which saves the money for use for future generations. There's the Available School Fund, which is funded by interest and dividends of the Permanent School Fund, but also a quarter of the motor fuels tax. So when you buy gas, you're taxed a certain amount on each gallon of gas, and a quarter of that goes to the Available School Fund. And then the Foundation School Program is just funded by margins taxes, the business taxes, some tobacco taxes, local property taxes, and then just general revenue budget. The money is spent by a school district on textbooks. It is distributed to the schools based on average daily attendance, and that's why attendance is such a big deal, such a big issue for schools, is because they are paid by, or they receive money by, the number of students who attend on a average daily basis. And then the foundation school program was established so that there would be this extra kind of, I don't want to say slush fund, but like soft money that, or flexible fund that could bring equality to school districts. So if a school district just seemed to have a little bit less money, they could maybe get kind of an equalization from this foundation school program. What are the issues? And this again is a place where if we had an in-person class, we would sit and debate. But should teachers be paid on their merit? If a teacher has better test scores in their classes, should they be paid more? Should well-performing schools be given special charters? So given a charter like a STEAM school or a performing arts school. Should people be given vouchers to pay for their school of choice? Either you get to not pay a voucher if you go, or not pay any money if you go to a public school, you would get that as a credit, or you would actually get money to go to get money from the state to pay to the school to go to maybe a charter school or a school of your choice. So maybe even a private school. And then if we talk about giving vouchers, is it okay if I get money from the state and I choose to send my child to a religious school? What kind of, establishment of religion, First Amendment issues are arising there? And finally, what about the curriculum? Texas is the one who controls the textbook market because we have the most people using textbooks in the country. And we also, can kind of control what those textbooks say and how we paint history. And that really affects the curriculum for, people nationwide. We have 5 million students nationwide, about 300,000 teachers, and a quarter of all the money that is spent in the state is spent on education. And so that's a significant amount of people who are affected by educational politics. When you talk about curriculum, so how many electives should each student be allowed to have, and what electives should they be? Should we require people to take Spanish in school, or should that be an elective? Should we require that each school district offer Mandarin and Spanish and French and German, and what other languages should we require that they offer? Should all of the curriculum be designed to college prep? What about kids who don't want to go to college? And what about kids who want to earn a living doing something else? Like, should we be required to teach students practical job skills like HVAC, heating, ventilation, and air conditioning, I believe is what it stands for, or plumbing, or electrician skills, things like that? Should the curriculum teach evolution? That's something that has been, taken all the way up to the Supreme Court. Should sex education include abstinence only? Should we talk about artificial birth control? Should we talk about, something else? Should a government class be required or be allowed to discuss the flaws of the government system? So should we require that everybody talk about maybe what's wrong with the Electoral College, or should we not be allowed to speak of something that we may see as a flaw in the system? What about the history of minorities and women? Do we talk about How far do we go on slavery, talking about the horrors of the history of that minorities and women have had? Do we offer elective Bible courses as maybe even a history, if not a religion class? And what about immersion or English as second language classes? Is that something that we support? Or is it something that we would say, sorry, if you're going to come to school in Texas, you have to speak English, and we're not going to give you any special treatment if English is not your first language? What caused the Civil War? Was it states' rights? Was it slavery? Was it something else? Should we include speeches by people like Jefferson Davis and Adolf Hitler? Should we teach the responsibility for the common good? So I would say like something socialist kind of teachings. Is separation of church and state in the United States Constitution? That's something you can go figure out for yourself. Is the right to bear arms in the Constitution? We know what the Second Amendment says, but does that give everyone the right to own a gun? Does it give everybody the right to own an assault rifle? Things like that. How long ago were fossil fuels formed? Some people believe it was millions and millions of years ago. Some people believe it was thousands of years ago. What about Osama bin Laden? Do we talk about whether his actions were consistent or inconsistent with commonly accepted Islamic teachings? Or do we say everybody who, believes in Islamic teachings is just like Osama bin Laden? Do we talk about global warming? That's something that's debatable. Do we talk about how you can prevent an unwanted pregnancy, abortion? Do we talk about abortion in schools? So as you can see, there are lots of issues that surround public schools. Some of the issues relate to faculty. The State Board of Education will establish just minimum qualifications. They will certify teachers, talk about the conduct of teachers, things like don't date your students, things like that. And they will leave the hiring and the firing and the discipline and things like that to the local school districts. And those are the local school boards or even the non-school board, non-elected school infrastructure. There are lots of issues relating to teachers, like their working conditions. Should they have to teach in person during a pandemic? Time constraints, how much time should they spend planning versus grading versus meeting with parents? How much money are they going to get paid? Teachers in Texas earn less, that should be earn, not learn, less than 9%, or 9% less than the national average. So Texas teachers aren't even paid the average of teachers in the United States. And then what about high stakes testing? So should we tie whether a teacher is hired or fired or retained or promoted or gets an increase or a decrease in salary based on how their students perform on a standardized test? And then there's a lot of student-based issues. What do we do about the number of students who attend public school? Do we increase class sizes? Do we increase the number of teachers? Do we, allow students to only come to school part-time? Do we require that students, or allow students to be taught in portable buildings? How do we address the achievement gap between different ethnic groups or different income groups? And then how much should Texas spend on each student? Currently, Texas spends less than the national average per student. Should we increase that? Higher education accounts for about 9% of the state's expenditures. And if you look at the enrollment, public schools in Texas have about 90% of enrollment, with 10% at private universities or colleges. There are 38 public university systems in Texas and 79 public community colleges. This higher education is administered by the Texas Higher Education Coordinating Board, which is appointed by the governor and has 18 members that are on different cycling terms for 6 years. The basic policies are set by the local Board of Regents of the actual schools, or the Board of Trustees, and those people hire chancellors, deans, presidents, things like that. So this is something that was probably of zero surprise to any of you, but enrollment at two-year colleges is increasing in Texas because more people see the benefit of the opportunities they can get from two-year colleges like TCC. So there are lots of politics surrounding higher education. These are also things that I would love to debate every single piece of with you guys in a class, but unfortunately we can't. So I want you to think about them on your own. Think about tuition costs. Are tuitions too high? Are they too low? What about tuitions during a pandemic? Should you still have to pay the same tuition? I know that at four-year colleges, they're not giving breaks to students on tuition and fees. What is the goal of higher education? Is it to make you a more well-rounded citizen? Is it to make you better equipped for a certain job? That affects the curriculum. Do you only give people classes in engineering if they're going to be an engineer, or do you require them to take multicultural classes too? How do you measure the success in achieving goals of the university? Does it mean if all of your people are happy at the end of graduation? Does it mean if everybody has a job at the end of graduation? Does it mean how much money each person makes that graduated from a college? Who is higher education accountable to? Are they accountable to the students or to the society as a whole, all the voters? What should higher education professors be paid? Are they overpaid? Are they underpaid? What about tenure? Should faculty have tenure? And tenure means that you can't be fired, period. You're permanently employed. And what effect should faculty evaluations have on, whether faculty are promoted or retained, or be suggested for tenure or given more money, things like that. How much freedom do faculty members have in what they teach? Could a government teacher teach, for example, the brilliance of Hitler or something like that? Would that be something that they were allowed to even consider, or is their curriculum set by the regents? And then how does the school spend money? Does the school spend money making their green spaces more beautiful, having more places for students to gather outdoors, having more state-of-the-art classrooms, having nicer faculty offices, things like that? I can tell you at TCC, I feel like there is, I don't feel like there's a problem with academic freedom. I don't have somebody who I have general guidelines of things that must be taught because, we want all of the government classes to be consistent throughout the system, and making sure that, that everybody's giving the same education. The books are chosen by, the department, and that is something that's great. I don't, it's not... I think that it's great to have a standardized book, and I think that if I wanted to give my opinion on a book, it would be well accepted. Higher education professors don't make a ton of money. This is not a job that is done for the money. This is a job that's done for the love of higher education and for the love of students and teaching. As far as evaluations go, I know that teaching is not, like your salary is not based on the evaluations, but I know that the evaluations are considered, and it's probably a great time to say you guys need to evaluate your faculty. You need to turn in student evaluations for all of your professors, and I mean through the university. I know that there's Rate My Professor and things like that, but it's really helpful for the university to know how students think that their professors are doing. And I feel like as far as TCC goes, I have not reviewed their budget, but it seems to me like the money is spent on things that benefit the students. There is always, if you've been to a TCC in-person class, you know that it's state-of-the-art in those classrooms, that the learning experience, there's everything that can enhance the learning experience. There is even online classes. There is tons of support for professors. There's tons of different ways professors can get information out. And so I think that, just from what I've seen in the tuition cost and how the money is spent, that it is spent at TCC on the students. What about affirmative action and diversity goals in higher education? Can a university say we want the diversity of our student body to look like the diversity of the state of Texas or the diversity of the United States, things like that? Can they consider that when they are admitting students? What about the retention of students? Do we try to wash all the kids out after the first semester, or do we really try to retain as many students as possible? What does it take for graduation? What courses are the university going to offer? How do we make universities and colleges accessible to students with lower incomes? What kind of financial aid is available? And should more money be spent on teaching or spent on research? And with money, what emphasis is put on the faculty? Should they spend more of their time teaching or more of their time researching and publishing? Okay, that's a lot of education, and I promise you that the rest of these will go much faster. But let's talk about healthcare, which is another kind of second biggest place where Texas spends money. So healthcare spending includes things like public assistance, Medicaid for the poor, TANF, temporary assistance for needy families, and then CHIP, the Children's Health Insurance Program. And these are all places where public funds are used to provide health care for people who need it. About $78.9 billion is spent on health care in Texas, about 36% of the budget. And most of this is from grants and aid from the federal government. So things like Medicaid is from the federal government. The Texas Health and Human Services Commission oversees a lot of a lot of healthcare related entities. They license nursing homes, child care providers, they license behavioral health services, they manage the state hospitals, and they provide framework for long-term care for people with disabilities. This is a public and private partnership because the Department of Health and Human Services is, a government agency, but it relies heavily on private influence, private input into, what should be considered in licensing, what kind of issues arise relating to, for example, state hospitals or long-term care for people with disabilities. So something that you might hear sometimes when healthcare is discussed is people will talk about, quote, socialized medicine. And so I kind of always like to talk about socialized medicine just a tiny bit, because socialized medicine makes it sound like it makes it sound pretty dreary, and it makes it sound like something that you would see in like communist Russia or something like that. We know that, quote, socialized medicine exists in Canada. And what it means is it's a healthcare system where the government hires the medical practitioners who work at government-owned facilities and directly provide healthcare. So an example of socialized medicine is the military hospitals, because the government hires those medical personnel, the doctors who work there. They own the facility and they directly provide the health care. So this sometimes also applies to some kind of, government provided healthcare insurance like Medicare or Medicaid. The practitioners are private, but they are paid directly from the government. And I would love to discuss with all of you whether you think this is good or bad. I think there's positives and negatives to this, definitely. And we've seen systems throughout the world where this works well and systems where this works poorly. Texas has some health insurance programs. Medicaid, which is assistance to people who have a certain income level. CHIP, Children's Health Insurance Program, again, health insurance for children who do not have private insurance. There are insurance programs that provide a minimum level of care for qualified low-income individuals and families who have enrolled in these, and they are funded by grants and aid. They are not Medicare. There's a difference between Medicare and Medicaid. Medicaid is an insurance program that you have to have a certain level of income to apply for. And Medicare is just for anybody who's over 65 years of age. Lots of issues surrounding healthcare, like we talked about socialized medicine. The Affordable Care Act. Was the Affordable Care Act great? Did it go too far, not far enough in what it tried to do? Is the individual mandate, meaning you're taxed if you don't have health insurance, a good idea? Are state-run marketplaces for the uninsured to buy health insurance a good idea? So you can, if you don't have insurance, you could go to a state-run marketplace and obtain insurance through there. So for example, say you're a solo practitioner and you work by yourself, you maybe have one employee. You don't really qualify for, going into a business healthcare kind of program, and so would you want to go into a state-run marketplace? What about Medicare for all? What about, does everybody get that kind of benefit? There are lots and lots of issues that surround healthcare, and this is something that is hotly debated, and it's very difficult to get a resolution because of the feelings on either side. Okay, I told you it was a lot shorter for these subsequent slides. So, income support programs. So what kind of assistance do we have in Texas? We have TANF, Temporary Assistance to Needy Families, which is a grant to the adult caretakers of children. And if you're an adult caretaker and you're not disabled, or you're not needed at home all the time for children, you also have to go to employment counseling, job placement, things like that. So it's benefits to people to try to help families who have children. There's also unemployment insurance that provides a partial income replacement for somebody who's lost a job. And this is something that is funded by taxes paid by employers. So you have to have been employed in order to get unemployment. Your eligibility is determined by your previous earnings, not your need. Your TANF is determined by your need, not what your previous earnings were. So as you can imagine, lots of issues surrounding this. Must a person be a citizen to get these kind of benefits? How long can they get them? What do we do about TANF recipients who have an absent parent? How much should the person who is receiving benefits be required to search for the absent parent? Should the people be required to register for job placement? What about if somebody quits a job or is fired for cause, fired for, doing something terrible at work? Do they still get to collect unemployment? Should employers be taxed on the number of claims that are made? So is an employer taxed based on the number of people who come through the system and then later file for unemployment, or should everybody have to pay the same amount? Okay, so let's talk about income redistribution or welfare programs in Texas. So income redistribution is things like welfare, food stamps, Medicaid, again, not Medicare for people over 65, Medicaid for people who meet a certain income requirement, unemployment compensation, the temporary assistance to needy families, business subsidies, regressive taxation, things like that. That is income redistribution. It's public taxes and public spending on people who meet some sort of low income standard. And they're the policy is to try to shift income from one group of people to another. So people who have a lot of money need to share it with people who have a little bit of money. It is based on if the difference between social insurance versus welfare is the money based, is the amount based on a tax, or is it based on a means test? Welfare is based on a means test, which is you have to make a certain low level, meet some certain low level of household income in order to qualify. Lots and lots of issues relating to welfare. How do you define it? What is the quote poverty level? What about government provided benefits that you receive? Is a big tax deduction for mortgage interest a form of welfare, because the government is basically giving up money, a tax deduction, based on your means? Is a big business bailout a form of welfare, because it is a business who is unable to meet a certain level of income, receiving money or assistance from the government? Is that considered welfare? What about what kind of assistance is available to people who are not disabled and don't have children? They don't qualify for any of the disability programs, and they don't qualify for the temporary assistance to needy families because they don't have children. What do we talk about? What do we do to talk about the resentment that when people resent others receiving money when they, necessarily aren't able to work or finding work? Do we even address that? What do we do to try to combat that, or do we? Should we prevent people who are on welfare from having more children? What do we do to address the cheating of the system? If people are somehow, circumventing the rules, what do we do about whether or not this is a system that is just creating people who are more dependent, or whether it is curing an actual, quote, poverty problem. Is poverty something that even should be addressed by society, or is that something that's more of an individual basis? And what's the cause of poverty? We could debate that for an entire semester. Okay, so finally, let's talk about transportation, because that is another place that Texas spends a big chunk of money. Texas spends money on mass transit and on highways. Those are the two big transportation places. Mass transit, things like DART or the TRE, the Trinity Railway Express. Where does Texas get its money for transportation? From federal gas taxes and federal funds. That way that the federal government can put strings attached to that money, require certain things like a legal drinking age in order to get that federal highway money. And then 61% of it comes from state motor vehicle registration or fuel taxes. The issues surrounding transportation are where do we build highways? Where do we just repair highways? Where do we make the highways go? Do we like or dislike or want more of or fewer of toll roads? What about mass transit? Do we want a subway system in Dallas and in Fort Worth and in our big cities, or do we want light rail? What kind of mass transit do we want? Just buses, things like that. And then the Trans-Texas Corridor is a huge debatable issue. It would be something that would cost about $200 billion. It would cover 4,000 miles. It would give super highways. So it would increase, the speed of transmission of freight, and also if you're commuting from, say, Austin to Dallas or Dallas to Houston, it would give you, a faster way to get from here to there. It would include railways, utility corridors. Right now we don't have a train that goes from Dallas to Houston, but you know what? There's a train that goes from New York to Washington, D.C., or from Boston to Washington. All those, up on the East Coast, there's lots of places, big cities you can get to by rail, but not in Texas. So lots and lots of different issues relating to Trans-Texas Corridor or just transportation in Texas in general. So that is the end of the public policy lecture. There are notes, but also there will be answers to those notes posted so that you will have an easier time preparing for your exam.